I have an illness where my memory only lasts one day. My boyfriend tells me every day that I am his lover. Until I saw him with another woman, holding her in his arms, and he smiled mischievously. Don't worry, she can't remember anything. But what he didn't know was that I had already recovered. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. When I woke up in the morning, a strange man held me in his arms. Before I could struggle, he spoke as if he had expected it. Irene, I am Rufus. I stiffened and looked up at him. He opened his eyes and met my gaze, his eyes still carrying the drowsiness of just waking up. You are my lover, Irene. Did you forget me again? His tone was natural and lazy. I slowly let down my guard. Should I remember? Rufus sighed, buried his head for a few seconds, and then sat up. His hair was messy, but it didn't affect his overall appearance. He picked up his phone, unlocked it with my fingerprint, and the screen showed a picture of us together. In the picture, I was leaning on Rufus's shoulder, smiling brightly. Irene will always love Rufus. I was a bit surprised. I had no memory of the scene, nor of Rufus. Rufus turned off the screen and tossed the phone aside, pulling me back into his arms, speaking unclearly. Be good, sleep a bit more. I couldn't sleep in Rufus's arms, so after his breathing steadied, I carefully got out of bed. There was a small note stuck beside the bed. Don't forget Rufus. I looked back and saw that Rufus was sleeping with his eyes closed, his brows slightly furrowed, not sleeping very soundly. Not just by the bed, but small notes like this could be seen all over the room. I leaned on the sink, lost in thought. After a while, a pair of hands suddenly wrapped around my waist. I looked up. In the mirror, Rufus rested his chin on my shoulder, his voice hoarse from just waking up. Irene, don't rush. I will always be with you. Rufus said that every day I would repeat this rhythm. Wake up, be confused, then slowly accept him. Rufus would also tell me every day that he loves me. When Rufus called me for breakfast, I stood awkwardly at the table. Sorry, I don't remember you. Rufus was stunned for a moment, then a helpless smile tugged at his lips. He leaned on the table, slowly bending down to look me in the eye. Those eyes were extremely handsome, full of deep affection and focus when looking at someone. Indeed, the type I would like. As long as I remember you, Irene. Rufus said softly, you will get better. He comforted me like this, but I clearly saw the sadness in his eyes when he turned his head. Are you very sad? Rufus held a glass of milk, leaning his head and thinking for a moment. How should I put it? I'm almost used to it. He turned to look at me and sighed. I just hope that one day when you wake up, you can remember me. Even if it's just in name. Rufus took me to the supermarket and at night, to a concert. He said these were on my previous wish list, and he would repeat these things from time to time. He rubbed my head. Irene, you need to get better soon. Under the streetlights, Rufus's expression was both doting and hopeful, making my heart race. Rufus. Did I really like you before? Even with amnesia, I could feel the intense emotions for this man in front of me. Rufus stopped in his tracks. He looked down at me and smiled. Rufus usually looked very good, but when he moved, there was an inexplicable bad boy charm about him. He thought for a moment and said slowly, you chased me for 6 whole months. Then I agreed. Sometimes I wonder if you're doing this on purpose as revenge. I will try to get better. I held his hand. Rufus, wait for me a bit longer. On the way back, suddenly a woman stumbled out from around the corner. She was swaying and unsteady on her feet. Fortunately, Rufus reached out in time to steady her. She had a pure face and tilted her head to smile at Rufus. Thank you. Rufus looked down at her, and they stared at each other for a few seconds before Rufus said in a deep voice, you're drunk. Being drunk is good. The woman laughed loudly. No one cares about me anyway. Being drunk is good. Being drunk doesn't hurt. For some reason, I felt there was something subtle between her and Rufus. Rufus held her arm tightly without letting go, and after a while, he said, it's not safe to drink late at night. Go home early. The girl didn't answer him but looked at me instead. You're so happy. My boyfriend doesn't want me anymore. I was still confused but replied honestly, if he doesn't want you, then you shouldn't want him either. There are plenty of men, no need to make yourself suffer. Yeah, her tone suddenly became sharp. How can someone eating candy understand bitterness? Rufus suddenly became impatient and let go of her hand. Irene, let's go home. After we got home, Rufus didn't look very happy. He leaned on the sofa, the game controller in his hand making noise. When the TV screen went black, he clicked his tongue and tossed the controller aside, lying back. What's wrong with you? Feeling his emotional fluctuation, I walked over. Rufus pulled himself together and hugged me. Irene, don't leave me. I really love you. I broke free from his embrace to look at him, curious. Rufus, that woman. Do you know her? Rufus's expression was indifferent, calmly saying, no. Just drunk. Before I could speak, Rufus kissed me, murmuring, Irene. Don't leave me. In the morning, I woke up feeling groggy. Rufus got up very early today. Hearing the sound, he came over and leaned against the door, watching me. Irene, good morning. I'm Rufus. I sat dazedly on the bed, watching Rufus walk over to face me. He gently said, did you forget me again? As usual, he played a video of us together. I looked up at him without saying a word. I watched as he brought me to the table and handed me a cup of hot milk. On the edge of the table was a note saying, Irene, remember to eat on time and love Rufus. Rufus, as if afraid of scaring me, said softly, don't be afraid, have breakfast first. I'll explain later. I sat at the table, holding the milk, sipping it slowly. My mind was in chaos. Before I could finish the milk and speak, there was a knock on the door. The knocking was rhythmic, 2 knocks followed by another 2. Rufus held the milk, his gaze dark as he looked over. The knocking continued. Rufus was silent for a moment, not intending to open the door nor ignoring it. He seemed to be deep in thought, then turned to meet my gaze. I'll go open it. Irene, I just stood up but was pressed down by Rufus. I'll get it, you eat first. His tone was natural. After speaking, he walked towards the door. The door was slightly opened, and I moved to see who it was. Behind the door, I saw a familiar face. It was the woman from last night. My hand holding the milk trembled uncontrollably, and I couldn't hear what they were talking about. Rufus suddenly slammed the door shut. Who was it? Don't know, Rufus explained calmly, wrong door. I looked at Rufus's natural expression, my heart skipping a beat. An indescribable feeling swirled in my chest. Actually, I didn't have time to tell Rufus. I could remember what happened yesterday. I lowered my head without speaking, feeling the milk in my hand gradually losing its warmth. She hadn't even changed her clothes before coming to find Rufus. Rufus stiffened for a moment but quickly returned to normal. He smiled at me, his actions and expressions flawless. As if he was really facing a stranger. I looked up at the door, an unconscious emotion brewing in my heart. After breakfast, Rufus said he would cut some fruit for me. Opening the fridge, he realized there was no fruit. He put on his coat and went out. Driven by some impulse, I walked to the window and looked down. Rufus's figure soon appeared below. A few seconds later, a figure suddenly rushed out from the side. Her target was clear, Rufus. My hand on the windowsill tightened unconsciously. Rufus obviously noticed her too, but he didn't move. When the girl got close, he suddenly stepped aside. The girl missed and fell to the side. Just as she was about to fall, she stopped in midair. A pair of hands firmly gripped her arm. Rufus ultimately didn't let her fall to the ground. I was too far to hear their conversation. But I inexplicably felt that at this moment, the girl's face was smiling. Rufus came back. He was carrying a bag of fruit. He personally cut up a fruit platter in the kitchen. From my angle, his profile was smooth and his expression focused and serious. As if sensing my gaze, Rufus looked up at me and curved his lips into a smile. While eating the fruit platter, I wondered if the look of love in someone's eyes could be faked. I couldn't tell. I spoke very little today. Rufus touched my forehead and asked if I wasn't feeling well. I lightly nodded. His expression suddenly changed, and he asked anxiously, "Where do you feel unwell?" "Why didn't you tell me?" I touched my chest and looked up at him. Here, it feels very stuffy. Rufus was suddenly stunned. Rufus, do you lie too? Rufus stared at me blankly, his eyes clear and reflecting my image. The room fell silent. Rufus was very smart. He asked back, Irene, did you see something? Don't overthink it. He raised his hand to smooth the ends of my hair, his voice very gentle. I do know her, but if you don't like it, I won't see her again. Okay? I didn't mean to hide it from you. He spoke so sincerely, I couldn't tell if his words were true or false. At night, Rufus stood by the bedside and turned off the light. Irene, it's time to sleep. I looked up at him. Aren't you going to sleep? Rufus was amused by this. I still have work to do, my dear. You go to sleep first. Rufus quietly closed the door and went to the living room. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. I only had memories of the past 2 days, I knew nothing else. Rufus didn't mention anything about the cause of my amnesia. But my current state seemed to be slowly recovering. Yet my heart was racing, always feeling like I was missing something. I didn't know how much time had passed when there was a knock on the door. In the quiet night, it was especially clear. 2 knocks, sounding rhythmically. I suddenly opened my eyes, and the knocking stopped. Instead, I heard the door open and a crisp female voice. Rufus. She came again. I climbed out of bed and opened the bedroom door. Rufus was no longer in the living room. An ashtray with several cigarette butts sat on the table. His phone was on the table, the screen still lit. I walked over and glanced at it. There were more than a dozen missed calls. And dozens of text messages. The last one was from 10 minutes ago. Then I'm coming to find you. The room door wasn't soundproof. I stood in the living room, listening to the female voice coming from the hallway. Rufus, why are you ignoring me? Layla. Rufus's voice was low and impatient, as if afraid of waking me. I told you not to come. Why? Keep your voice down, she doesn't sleep well. But I'm suffering from insomnia, Rufus. Her voice was sweet and coy. Can you help me sleep? Layla. I walked step by step to the door and quietly opened it. The hallway was dimly lit, the 2 of them standing there. The night was already cold, and Layla was dressed lightly. She looked up at Rufus and repeated, I'm suffering from insomnia. Rufus stood in front of her, holding a cigarette, not speaking. Layla waited for a response but didn't get one. She nodded knowingly. Then I'll go drink. She turned to leave but was pulled back by her arm. Rufus suppressed his anger. I told you, it's not safe to drink at night. Layla turned back with a giggle. Why do you care? If you care about me, what about your Irene? She suddenly pointed at me, making eye contact. In her bright, provocative eyes, I saw defiance. Rufus's body stiffened. He quickly let go of her hand and turned to look at me, his face instantly pale. Layla laughed heartily on the side. What now? Rufus brought me back into the room, slamming the door shut. Shutting out Layla's laughter. He looked down at me, his expression full of helplessness. He held my hand and asked, Irene, are you cold? I looked at him calmly. You said you wouldn't see her. I didn't intend to. Rufus's voice lowered. I really didn't contact her. Who is she? A friend. What kind of friend? Rufus fell silent. Last night ended on a sour note, and the next day, Rufus didn't mention a word about it. What happened last night seemed to be buried along with me in yesterday. For Rufus, it was a brand new day. He would still introduce himself to me, tirelessly telling me day after day how much he loved me. But Layla did not stay in yesterday. She would appear in our daily life. She started bringing breakfast every morning and would wait downstairs when Rufus went out to take out the trash. She would stubbornly hold Rufus's hand. I watched Rufus's figure standing still from the window and suddenly pulled the corners of my mouth. In almost an instant, many images flashed through my mind. But the images moved too fast for me to see clearly. I covered my head and squatted down, slowly breathing until I calmed down. When I looked up again, Rufus was no longer downstairs. When he came back, he would still say he loved me. He would thoughtfully and meticulously handle every little thing, even details I hadn't noticed. He would rub my head and tell me we had many more years to come. But he didn't reject Layla's advances. He would hold my hand and tell me never to leave him. But he couldn't bear to leave Layla, who waited alone downstairs for him late at night. He would stay up late making the things I wanted to eat. He would also place the little paper star Layla gave him in a conspicuous place in the kitchen. Rufus loved me very much when Layla wasn't around. I watched Rufus's anxious figure rushing around when I coughed and his furrowed brows when I was unhappy. Suddenly, I felt lost. Do you think it's possible for one person to love two people at the same time? That morning, the wind was very cold. Layla was carrying breakfast, trying to step into the door. Her voice was really endearing, and like her appearance, pure and harmless yet with a strong sense of invasion. Rufus. It's really cold today. My hands are red from the cold. Let me warm up. I heard Layla's voice coming through the crack in the door while I was in the bedroom. Rufus's interactions with her had always been downstairs. This was the first time he relented. He was silent for a long time before he slightly opened the door. Only 10 minutes. Don't say anything inappropriate. Layla pouted but wisely didn't argue. Rufus handed me the soy milk as usual. Since Layla started bringing breakfast, the hot milk had been uniformly replaced with soy milk. Rufus softly reminded me, "Be careful, it's hot." The faint aroma of soy milk wafted over, but I didn't drink it. My gaze fell on Layla on the sofa. Rufus followed my gaze, his eyes devoid of emotion. His lies came easily, and he calmly said, "She's here to get something and will leave soon." "Hello," Layla tilted her head at me, "I'm Rufus's friend." She deliberately paused for a second before the word friend, as if lingering on a particular term. Her features were too clean, making her words seem so innocent and pure. She leaned on the sofa casually, as if she was in her own home. I expressionlessly knocked over the soy milk. Rufus turned around and looked at me. "Irene? Did it burn you?" "I think the soy milk tastes weird." I lowered my eyes and said lightly, "I can't eat it." I went back to my room and squatted down, holding my head. Hearing Layla's provocative tone, I seemed to recall many images. Images of Rufus feeding Layla cake. Images of Rufus and Layla looking into each other's eyes. Images of Layla hugging Rufus from behind, pleading softly for him not to leave. I thought I should take some time to let my memory fully recover. I needed to know how much Rufus had hidden from me. Rufus's knocks on the door grew more anxious, and finally, he used a key to open the door. His voice was filled with fear. "Irene, what's wrong?" I took a moment to calm down before looking up at Rufus. "I don't like soy milk. I want porridge." Rufus didn't say a word and went downstairs to buy it. Before he left, he gave Layla a meaningful look, probably telling her not to say anything. Layla sat on the sofa, slowly drinking the soy milk. After finishing, she took out a handful of candy from her pocket. She stared at me as she leisurely unwrapped a candy and put it in her mouth. The crisp sound of her teeth biting the candy echoed in the room. She licked her lips slightly and threw the candy wrapper on the floor. "Very sweet. Do you want some?" "But I only have one." "Sorry." As if afraid Layla would say something, Rufus came back quickly. He was carrying the porridge, slightly out of breath. "Irene, I bought both sweetened and unsweetened porridge. Which one do you want to drink today?" I shook my head. "I don't want to drink it now." Rufus was momentarily speechless. He placed the porridge on the table. "It's okay, you can drink it later. I'll heat it up if it gets cold." He spoke so naturally with indulgence, but Layla's expression changed. She turned her head away irritably, making a strange snort. Rufus turned to her. "You can leave now." Layla started coming over more and more frequently. I could clearly feel Rufus's changing emotions towards her. Maybe Rufus always had feelings for her, which is why he allowed her to show up time and time again. They used the guise of friendship to act freely at home. Layla would politely greet me in front of Rufus, but behind the scenes, she would secretly tug at his shirt. I even saw her feed Rufus a piece of cantaloupe in the kitchen. Rufus didn't refuse. He just frowned slightly but still opened his mouth to eat it. I silently looked away and went to the bathroom to throw up until I felt dizzy. My memories were slowly coming back. Everyone I knew in college was aware that I liked Rufus. How much did I like him back then? I would leave school in the middle of the night just to bring him a drink at the internet cafe where he was hanging out. Just to see him. If Rufus spoke to me, it would make me happy for an entire class. Back then, it was pure affection, untainted by anything else, just wanting to be good to him. Doing my best. My efforts weren't unreciprocated. Rufus gradually started paying attention to me. He began to like me, even more than I liked him. We got together. He would get up early to make me a lovingly prepared lunch, even though it looked terrible. He wanted everyone to know that I was his girlfriend. I was never left out of his plans. He seemed like a perfect boyfriend, flawless. I thought we could always be together. Until Layla appeared. When she showed up, I didn't notice Rufus's gaze. If I had been more observant, I would have seen the unusual emotion in his eyes. Layla was his first love from his youth. Perhaps out of guilt, Rufus became even more attentive to me. I used the excuse of unfamiliarity to deliberately keep my distance from him. The closer he got, the more nauseous I felt. Rufus's gaze became more and more filled with grievance and disappointment. Sometimes, he would sit across from me, watching but not daring to come closer. He said, "Irene, your condition seems to be getting worse. Can I hold you?" His voice seemed to drop to the ground. I didn't respond. Probably because of my distancing, Rufus and Layla's relationship grew closer. He transferred all his unmet emotions to Layla. Layla appeared innocent, but she knew exactly how to capture Rufus's heart. Just when Rufus started to pay more attention to her, she disappeared. This push-and-pull tactic seemed to drive Rufus crazy. Layla was gone for a while, and when she returned, I could sense Rufus's obvious emotional turmoil. Rufus was probably really starting to fall for her. What puzzled me was that Rufus's love for me hadn't diminished at all. He was still as considerate and caring towards me. Layla came back again. When Rufus received her call, he was clearly stunned for a second. Layla could now come and go freely. Her attitude towards Rufus suddenly turned cold. Instead of her previous aggressive approach, she leaned towards a more teasing one. Rufus no longer clearly rejected her. She sat on the sofa, crossing her legs and smiling at me. Rufus peeled an orange for me and then casually peeled one for Layla too. I watched as Rufus handed her the orange, saying nothing. Layla took the orange nonchalantly and smiled at Rufus. "Thanks, brother." Rufus's body stiffened. Today, it was the brother-sister act. So Rufus had more opportunities to take care of her. I lowered my eyes and ate the orange, suddenly letting out a laugh. Both of them looked over at me. "Rufus, is she your sister?" I asked him. Maybe my tone was too forceful, and Rufus suddenly seemed a bit flustered. He quickly steadied himself and vaguely replied, "A neighbor's sister, Irene, you." He was testing me. I didn't say anything more. Rufus now seemed very afraid of me regaining my memory. I watched them in the kitchen. Layla was dressed very provocatively today, creating a stark contrast with her innocent face. She flirted with Rufus, but deftly dodged his touch at the last moment. Rufus's throat moved, and suddenly, he reached out and pulled Layla close. They were very close, their eyes locked, and Rufus spoke in a low voice. "Layla, don't provoke me." Layla was smiling. She enjoyed Rufus's closeness. "Does your Irene know about this?" I looked up quietly at the man not far away. He pretended to be my loving boyfriend in front of me, but behind my back, he tightly held another woman. He was also very aware that I only had a day's memory. No matter what he said or did, I wouldn't know. He held Layla even tighter and stared down at her. He finally stopped suppressing his emotions and spoke softly. "She won't know. She can't remember." "Yes." Layla's smile grew even more cheerful. I saw this scene clearly. But what he didn't know was that I had already recovered. My fingers loosened slightly, and the glass slipped from my hand. A very piercing sound rang out. Rufus and Layla turned to look at me simultaneously. Before they could see me, I quickly looked away. Rufus rushed out of the kitchen, anxiously checking if I was hurt. Sometimes men can be terrifying creatures. He was standing right in front of me, but I couldn't tell if he was acting. Just like now, The worry in Rufus's eyes was real, and his fear of me being hurt was real too. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't believe that the words just now came from this man who was now full of concern for me. I stared at him blankly. Are you very worried? What nonsense are you talking about? Rufus frowned. Are you hurt anywhere? No. Rufus finally breathed a sigh of relief and told me to be more careful in the future. Layla also came out, standing at the kitchen door, looking at Rufus's back, and then reluctantly looked away. Her possessiveness towards Rufus was gradually increasing too. My memory had fully returned. My amnesia was indeed related to them. There's a saying that cheating happens either 0 times or countless times. Before the accident, I had already discovered the affair between Rufus and Layla. It was just that my emotions were too intense that night, and I had an accident while driving. This led to temporary partial amnesia. After my accident, Rufus told Layla that he had cut off contact with her. He probably really wanted to turn over a new leaf, but it didn't last long. Layla's appearances repeatedly shook his resolve. My condition also became Rufus's cover. If I hadn't regained my memory, how long would Rufus have planned to keep this from me? How far would they have gone? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. It was just that looking back on this year's relationship, it felt particularly ridiculous. At night, Rufus went to see her again. I went out alone, walking under the streetlights, and recalled many things. From when we met, to when he pursued me, to when we got together. Late at night, it's especially suitable for reminiscing. When did Rufus start to change his heart? Was it from the moment Layla first appeared, or from the time she brought him water under the pretext of a class? When Rufus was with me, did her image involuntarily appear in his mind? I didn't even know when he added her contact information. I only remembered that it seemed to be one night while we were taking a walk, I suddenly saw a message pop up. Layla said, "Thank you, brother." At that time, I didn't pay much attention, but now looking back, everything has traces to follow. Did Rufus love me? Or was it more guilt? He kept me in the dark, right under my nose, while professing his love for her. When Rufus came back, I ran into him on the road. He was carrying my favorite snacks and waved at me. He scolded me for sneaking out and told me to wait for him at home. Yes, before he went out, he had said he was going to buy snacks for me. I lowered my eyes to the bag of snacks and smiled at Rufus. But I missed you so much. With a thud, the bag fell to the ground. Rufus froze in place, his voice trembling. Irene, what did you say? Rufus, I remember now. I stared at Rufus and said each word clearly. I think I remember. Rufus's face instantly showed a mixture of surprise and doubt, and he stared at me in a daze. The look in his eyes was filled with complex emotions, and his voice was unsteady. What do you remember? I grinned. Today is our 100th day anniversary. Rufus was stunned for a long while. 100 days? 100 days was when Rufus liked me the most, and I liked Rufus the most. Rufus looked at me cautiously, repeatedly confirming that my memory was confused again, and then he breathed a sigh of relief. I leaned on Rufus's shoulder, tilted my head, and asked if he would always only like me. He lowered his head to meet my eyes and answered without hesitation. I smiled happily. Rufus looked at my expression and smiled too. He raised his hand and patted my head. Irene, what about you? Will you always love me? Of course. I looked into his eyes and answered without hesitation. I will always love you and never leave you. We will get married and have our own life. We will be together for a long, long time. Rufus looked at me, his eyes burning, as if those scenes had already come true. A smile spread across his lips, and he softly promised, I will love you for a long time too. Rufus became more and more considerate towards me. He even wouldn't let me go alone to fetch hot water. When I sat on the balcony basking in the sun, I occasionally thought of the past. Rufus was getting closer to the way he was before. I would also stare at him and repeat every day that I love you. He seemed to really believe it. It was a cloudy day. Layla came. Before Rufus could open the door, I had already rushed to open it. I leaned against the door and looked at her. Who is it? Layla stood at the door. She was good at using her appearance to her advantage and smiled slightly at me, politely saying she had something to discuss with Rufus. I called Rufus over. Who is she? Rufus answered casually, a friend. Why don't I know her? Rufus clearly stiffened. There was no Layla in the 100 days of memory. I'm not very familiar either. Rufus lied, and Layla's face changed. When she tried to enter as usual, I blocked her. Rufus, I said firmly, I don't know her, she can't come in. Rufus was silent for a second. Okay. Layla's face changed. For some reason, she insisted on stepping into the door. Rufus blocked the door and didn't back down. The two of them said something, and Layla's face got worse and worse. In the end, they parted unhappily. Layla left in a bad mood, and Rufus seemed to be in a bad mood too. I lay on the sofa, drank a sip of my drink as if nothing had happened. In the evening, Rufus found an excuse to go out. Before he left, I held his arm and told him I was scared to be home alone and asked him to come back early. Rufus's expression softened a bit. He touched my head and said softly, Irene, wait for me, I'll be back soon. I let him go. It started raining outside. Rufus was gone for a long time. I took a nap, and he still hadn't come back. The next second, a message came on my phone. Rufus said a friend had an accident, and he wouldn't be coming back. I held my phone in silence for a moment and replied with 4 words. My head really hurts. Rufus's call came immediately, but I didn't answer. I grabbed an umbrella and went to the convenience store to buy a small cake and candles. The lighter clicked and lit up. I recorded a video. Under the dim yellow light, the candle flame flickered slightly. I forced a smile at the screen. Rufus, today is your birthday. I went downstairs to buy a cake. But the cake shop was closed. I only got this. Where are you? Why aren't you back yet? My head really hurts. My phone is out of battery. The power is out at home too. Where are you? After sending these, I raised my hand and turned off the phone. Rufus came back quickly. He was drenched with rain, and the fragments on his forehead were also wet. He pushed the door open forcefully and met my gaze on the sofa. I was holding a cake, looked up at him, and murmured after a while. Why did you come back so late? The light from the corridor seeped in, and Rufus's eyebrows slowly furrowed. He took a deep breath, walked over quickly, and held me in his arms. Sorry, Irene. There won't be a next time. I asked Rufus to blow out the candles. I told him today was the first birthday I spent with him. The guilt in his eyes was about to overflow. While he was cutting the cake, I sneaked a glance at his phone. Layla had sent a screen full of messages. The moment she called, I muted his phone and stuffed it into the sofa crevice. After hiding the phone, I looked up and met Rufus's eyes. His eyes were full of warmth. Irene. In the future, we'll have many more birthdays together. I nodded lightly. Rufus seemed to be talking to himself, softly murmuring, I won't leave you this time. Playing the sympathy card works best for someone with a guilty conscience. I used the same trick again, waiting for Rufus in the wind on his way home. Rufus's eyes were red when he saw me. After that day, he seemed to have stopped contacting Layla. I secretly checked his phone, and at some point, Layla was added to the blacklist. Rufus was still in the kitchen, carefully preparing dinner for me, and I threw the phone on the sofa. I chuckled slowly, a bit mockingly. Layla came again. This time, her face no longer had that calm expression. She asked Rufus what he meant. Rufus blocked the door, his eyes subconsciously glancing inside. He said indifferently, it means nothing, we shouldn't contact each other anymore. Not contact? Layla couldn't believe it. Then what was everything between us? I told you long ago, Irene is my girlfriend. Rufus's voice carried a bit of impatience. Stop looking for me. So, when you said you would break up with her to be with me, that was a lie too? Layla, stop making a scene. Rufus's voice was very low. Irene is sick, I won't leave her. I just want to take good care of her now. Layla lost control of her emotions and choked. What about me? Layla and Rufus argued for a while, using both soft and hard tactics. I knew Rufus wasn't a faithful person. I watched the two downstairs, silently biting the candy in my mouth with a crunch. Layla liked to come in the evening, almost at a fixed time. In the evening, I sent Rufus to buy something from a street some distance away from the community. Before leaving, Rufus hesitated. That place is a bit far. I want to eat it. Okay, then wait for me, Irene. Rufus finally went out. After seeing him walk away, I put on Rufus's coat and went downstairs. As expected, I ran into Layla at the entrance of the community. She stared at the coat I was wearing. Her expression suddenly changed. After all, it was a gift from her to Rufus. I sent a message to Rufus. A girl is coming to see you, Rufus. She looks fierce. Just after sending it, I saw Layla walking over from the corner of my eye. She stared at the coat, chuckled. This coat looks familiar, my boyfriend has one too. What a coincidence. I smiled at her. This is my boyfriend's. Your boyfriend? Layla sneered at the words. Layla looked me up and down, her eyes turning provocative. I forgot to introduce myself. My boyfriend's name is Rufus. I stood frozen in place at the right moment. Layla curled her lips. You probably don't know, your boyfriend likes me. I frowned tightly. What nonsense are you talking about? Rufus only loves me. Loves you? Layla laughed. Is it love or guilt? Can you tell the difference? Of course Before I could finish, she suddenly reached out and yanked the coat off me. She held the coat, looking down at me. You don't deserve to wear this. It seemed like I finally got angry. I raised my hand and slapped her. With a crisp sound, her head turned to the side. She stood there, stunned, not noticing the figure quickly approaching from behind. My fingers were numb from the slap. I looked at her and said loudly, I don't believe it. Rufus only loves me. He said he would marry me. I believe him. Layla's breathing became rapid. She lowered her head and cursed. Just as she was about to raise her hand, her arm was suddenly grabbed by someone. She seemed to sense something and turned her head, meeting an extremely cold face. Rufus. Rufus yanked me behind him and said word by word, who allowed you to come here? Layla's eyes reddened on the spot. Can't I come? What did you say to Irene? Rufus seemed really angry. His fingers trembled as he held my hand. I made it very clear that night. The one I love is Irene. From now on and forever. Don't come and disturb us again. Layla's face instantly turned pale. She looked at Rufus and suddenly choked up. Can you really forget me? Are you with her out of guilt? I'm the one you love the most. Rufus pulled me back a step and said coldly, you're overthinking it. With just 4 simple words, Layla couldn't hold back her tears and cried. Rufus took me back to the room. As soon as we entered, I shook off his hand. Who is she? An ex-girlfriend, we broke up a long time ago. Rufus lied effortlessly. Did she bully you? Irene, I'm sorry. I won't let her appear again next time. I will handle this matter properly. Don't overthink it, trust me, okay? The last time Layla came, she was much calmer. There was no hysterical outburst, no nonsense. She just silently stared at Rufus. Stared for a long time. She asked him, do you really not love me anymore? Rufus, one last time. I just need one word. Rufus, holding a cigarette, replied without hesitation, yes. My future lover will only be one person. And that's Irene. Layla stared at her, stubbornly refusing to shed a tear. After a long time, she gritted her teeth and said, then I will punish you by making sure you never get me again. Layla left. A few days after she left, she suddenly sent Rufus a message. Rufus was in the shower, and I glanced at the phone. Layla sent a long message. I skimmed through it and was somewhat surprised. Layla said she would give Rufus one last chance. If he didn't show up at the Civil Affairs Bureau in 3 days, she would marry a man 20 years older than her. I stared at the screen and silently laughed. A woman in love is the most foolish when she uses self-harm as a bargaining chip to hope a scumbag will come back. I picked up the phone and replied with 4 words, expressionless. Congratulations on your wedding. Then I blocked the number. Layla really got married. I also couldn't keep up the pretense anymore. Having lost contact with Layla, Rufus has been even more perfect during this time than when we first got together. He truly embodied the word loyalty and love. That night, I even told him that we would get married next month. He happily agreed and lowered his head to kiss me, but I dodged. I always used not feeling well as an excuse to refuse him, and he completely respected that, never stepping over the line. Rufus became more and more inseparable from me. He truly fell completely in love with me. It's rare to see a rogue reform, and I'm fortunate enough to witness it. Rufus had been acting strangely these past few days. When I pushed open the door, the room was pitch black. Suddenly, a faint light slowly appeared, followed by candles being lit one by one. Many people suddenly appeared in the room, some familiar faces, probably all friends of Rufus. In the candlelight, Rufus came out holding a large bouquet of flowers. He looked particularly happy today, with a gentle smile on his face. He slowly walked up to me and placed the bouquet in my arms. He said he had been planning this for many days, and I could even see his fingertips trembling slightly. Under everyone's gaze, he knelt down on one knee, slowly opened a box, sincere and serious. "Irene, will you marry me?" There was a burst of cheering around us, rising and falling. I looked around the room, which had been carefully decorated. This proposal, Rufus had really put his heart into it. He looked up at me, his eyes brighter than the candlelight. "Irene?" I gently took the ring, and before Rufus could stand up, I threw it out the door. The sound of the ring hitting the ground was faint, but it completely drowned out the cheers in the room. The room fell silent in an instant, eerily quiet. Everyone was frozen in place, only the candlelight flickering. I stared at Rufus's face and said word by word, "Rufus, let's break up." Rufus's face turned pale instantly, his voice trembling. "What? Break up?" My voice was exceptionally clear in the room, and I stared at his face, enunciating each word clearly. I said, "Let's break up." I let my memory stay at the time when we loved each other the most. I played the role of someone deeply in love with Rufus. I wanted him to fall in love with me again in this atmosphere. Then, leave him when he loved me the most. I did it. Rufus went crazy, he grabbed my hand, his breathing unsteady. "Irene, stop it." That night I said nothing, just pried his fingers off one by one, turned around and walked out the door. After that day, Rufus started to frequently seek reconciliation with me. He never understood why we broke up. He blocked me at the door. After a few days, he looked much more haggard, and his voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Irene, why did we break up? Did I do something to upset you? Was the proposal too sudden? But that night you said you wanted to marry me, didn't you? Can we start over?" "Irene, please don't mention breaking up." He tried to find every excuse to win me back. I leaned against the wall, watching his frantic state, and slightly curled my lips. "Do you want to know the reason?" "Yes." "It's simple," I said calmly. "I'm tired of you. Don't bother me anymore." The light in Rufus's eyes gradually dimmed, and he laughed quietly. "It's not funny, Irene. I don't like this joke. Please don't leave me." His voice was choked with sobs, a humility he had never shown before. "I beg you." He touched his chest. "It hurts here. Hurts so much I can't sleep at night." "Really?" I squeezed past him. "But what does that have to do with me?" I hadn't walked far when Rufus's voice suddenly came from behind. "Irene," he trembled, "did you regain your memory?" I paused and looked back at him. "Regain?" I laughed. "When do you mean?" Rufus frowned, and before he could speak, I continued. "Oh, I might have forgotten to tell you. That night when I went for a walk and met Layla. I regained my memory then." As soon as I finished speaking, I saw Rufus freeze in place. The color drained from his face, full of shock and fear, trying to say something but unable to make a sound. After a while, he seemed to find his voice, weakly saying, "Irene, let me explain." "Explain what?" I smiled. After all, I only had one day's memory. With only one day's memory, I wouldn't know anything. Rufus was completely speechless this time. He stumbled, barely managing to steady himself against the wall. He spoke, his smile tinged with desolation. So, you knew all along. You knew everything. I thought we could go back to the way things were. He smiled. Do you know how happy I was when you told me about our 100-day anniversary? Irene. I really wanted to continue with you. I truly know I was wrong. Back then, I had already planned our future. I was planning our future, but you were planning to leave. Irene, you are so cruel. Yes. I nodded in agreement. Do you know how disgusted I've been this whole time with you? Disgusted? Rufus repeated the word, laughing softly. So, this is how you felt all this time. Was it also a lie when you said you wanted to marry me? When did Irene learn to lie so well? You acted so convincingly. I took it seriously, Irene. Yes, I know I let you down. But I am really trying to correct my mistakes. Didn't you feel it during this time? I have never humbled myself like this for anyone. Irene. He looked up at me, his voice low and filled with sorrow. Can you give me another chance? I turned and walked away with ease. I'm going to throw up. Irene. Rufus stepped forward and grabbed my wrist. Can you really forget me? Please give me one more chance. I really can't live without you. Here. It really hurts. Don't leave me. I called the police. Before leaving, I gave Rufus the middle finger through the police station window. After leaving the station, I went to the mall. While I was about to pick out a necklace, I suddenly ran into Layla. Compared to Rufus's changes, hers were even more drastic. In such a short time, she had become unrecognizable. She seemed to have aged a lot, as if one could age so much in such a short time. Later, I learned that Layla's decision to marry a man 20 years older wasn't entirely because of Rufus. It was because that man had money. She was greedy for it, but after getting pregnant, she found out. The so-called wealth was just an illusion, and now she had lost everything. She also noticed me, her eyes avoiding mine. Before I could greet her, the person next to her forcefully took her away. It seemed her life was not going well. I smiled with satisfaction. Rufus started appearing frequently. He changed his strategy from pestering to silently caring. He brought me breakfast in the morning and a flower in the evening. He even went across the city to buy the food I wanted. He used the methods I once used to pursue him, responding to me in kind. He begged for one more chance. The last chance. He promised he wouldn't let me down again. He wrote a long apology letter. But I didn't open it, I threw it directly into the trash. When I looked up again, I met his hurt gaze. He forced a smile and waved at me. Irene. Good evening. Rufus persisted longer than I expected. He even tattooed my name on his body. But I had reached the point where I was disgusted just by seeing him. The hurt I suffered during that time couldn't be healed by a few apologies. I admit I was wrong, but I really know my mistake now. Rufus's eyes were red, and he hugged me tightly, his voice choked with tears. I really wanted to marry you, Irene. I'm begging you, please give me another chance. I didn't push him away. After a long silence, I whispered in his ear. This Saturday. Wait for me here. I might consider it. Rufus couldn't speak clearly, and after a long silence, he nodded. Irene. I interrupted in time. Whatever you have to say, save it for then. That Saturday, it started raining in the morning. By noon, it was pouring. When I got to the station, I noticed that Rufus had called many times. I didn't say anything, turned off my phone, and threw the SIM card out the window. I left the city. I moved to a coastal city. It's what I've always liked. I don't know how long Rufus waited that day, but I no longer cared. When I went to the beach in my free time, I liked to sit on the sand, quietly listening to the sound of the waves, and took a long breath. This relationship, with all its ups and downs, had consumed my youth. When my memory returned, I didn't immediately think of breaking up. But I chose to hide it. If we broke up, Rufus had other options. I never considered myself magnanimous enough to bless others. I wanted him to remember the moment I left, deeply. I wanted him to fall from the highest point. So, when I left, I gave Rufus and Layla a gift. Layla, in a fit of anger, chose to marry an unsuitable man. Her married life was unhappy. And Rufus, as if his soul had been extracted, was listless every day. Freed from Rufus, I felt like I had escaped from a sea of suffering. I traveled to many places, experiencing and seeing sights I had never seen before. I felt genuinely happy and relieved. Life is long. I will start anew and welcome a life that belongs to me. Starting from now.